So welcome back to this afternoon's session, everybody. Hope you had a pleasant, if abbreviated, lunch. We had a phenomenal morning with Lydia and Bala, and no less promising an afternoon. We have a whole array of talent still on the program, and now it's a great pleasure to introduce two people whom I know in several capacities. Basically, our paths have intersected in New York in various ways, although none of us is from New York. You know, I mean, I think that's the thing about Manhattan. I think most people in Manhattan are not from Manhattan, but you know, are New Yorkers nonetheless. And Skye Cleary has been a certified member of APPA for several years, has taught and published well. She's known in various fixtures in New York, and one of her books include Existentialism and Romantic Love by Paul Graven Macmillan. You've taught a course on that too, right? I know you taught a course at City College. Maybe among other places, and has co-authored this book, How to Live a Good Life. She's been involved with Massimo in this project, and is so she's very interesting. We're going to be tag teamed in this session by Skye and Massimo. Massimo is a colleague of mine at City College as well, and my hat's off to Massimo because he's also the incoming interim chair of our department this year. Better you than me, Massimo. You picked a really good time to take this on, and we'll be putting your Stoicism to the test in pretty short order, I should think.
Yeah, I knew there was a reason you hired me a few years ago. You know?
Well, this is
you
it.
Knew that was coming.
You're the ace in the hole, Massimo. You've been the card up the sleeve the whole time. And now we are playing you and hoping, you know, that you're going to, no pun intended, trump everybody. We'll see what happens, but we are in dire straits. And that, as you know, is about to, you know, there will be kinds of austerities for sure. Everyone's paying a price for this pandemic beyond the medical crisis. There are many and the economic problems. So we will entrust our fiscal well-being, Massimo, in your good hands when you become chair shortly next month. But for the moment, we welcome you as a fellow practitioner and also someone who's been involved in philosophical practice for a very long time. My first encounter with Massimo was way back, I think, in the 90s, wasn't it, when you were in Tennessee? Yeah. And he was founder and president of something called was it the East Tennessee Rationalists?
The Rationalists
must have been just
Tennessee.
you.
You got pretty close.
Rationalists of Tennessee. That must have been just you. I mean, a small club.
No, there was actually, believe it or not, we have about 100 members.
100? Okay, well, that's very impressive. You rounded them all up, I guess. But then, and you were doing this kind of thing even back then. And now, of course, you've had a long-running podcast. You're an author of many books, and as well as the Irani chair of philosophy at City College. So without further ado, we're going to be tag teamed now by Skye and Massimo, and they're going to give us their take on what's happening with Stoicism, and a lot is, right? There's an awful lot happening with it. It's making a huge comeback, not only because of its intrinsic worth, but because there are many practitioners on the ground who are rekindling the demand and also supplying it. So I hope you'll be able to tell us more about your work as well, in addition to your treatment of how to live a good life. So without further ado, I'll make you a co-host, Massimo, so you can show us your slides.
Great, thank you.
All right, let's see if this works. Co-host, and maybe you'll need to unco-host yourself afterward. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out. All right. All right. Thanks again, Skye and Massimo, and it's all yours.
Thank you. So what Skye and I want to do today, by way of a slide presentations where we're both going to do a little bit of a voiceover, so just to keep things going in a visual way and help people, you know, sort of figuring out in terms of attention, because one of the problems with these Zoom meetings is that you're just staring at a screen, which is what we already do all day long. So we figured that a little bit of visual help is going to be a good thing. What we want to do is to talk a little bit about the general concept of a philosophy of life. What does it mean? Why would people be interested, or should they be interested in that sort of stuff? And then we'll give actually short two examples of philosophies of life. One is Stoicism, as Lou pointed out. The other one is existentialism, which is Skye's review, and then we're going to wrap it up with some kind of general comments at the end. The book that Lou is referring to is How to Live a Good Life, which just came out a few months ago, and it's a co-edited book. The third co-editor is Dan Kaufman, and the book actually covers 15 different philosophies of life, and the whole point of the book is actually to do what I'm about to do in the introduction, so to present to people this notion that there is such a thing as a philosophy of life. You probably have one already, even if you don't realize it, and you might as well actually pay attention to it and see what it is. So let me see if I can share the screen. And you should be able to see the first slide, right?
Yes.
Okay, good, great, thank you. Thank you for the feedback, because, you know, with these electronics, you never know. All right, so let's get started. The first question that we address, as I said, is, you know, who needs a philosophy of life in the first place? And to begin with, I want to propose that a philosophy of life is made at a, usually of, although there is variations on this theme, it's made of about three components. A metaphysics, which is basically an account of how the world works. An ethics, which is an account of how we should live in the world. And then a set of practices, which is a set of actual things that people practically do to get themselves to live in a certain way, right? So for instance, think of Christianity. As I'll say in a minute, I think of all religions as philosophies of life as well. But think of Christianity. If you're a Christian, then your metaphysics, of course, involves a creator God who's omnipotent and created the world, you know, and loves us individually and all that sort of stuff. If you, in terms of ethics, if you're a Christian, then you follow the Ten Commandments, you use the life of Jesus as your inspiration and so on. And in terms of practices, you know, you go to church, you listen to the preacher, you pray, you read scriptures, you talk to other practitioners, that sort of stuff. So, as I just said, by definition, or at least according to this definition, religions actually do count as philosophies of life. So I don't actually make a strong line of demarcation between religions and philosophies of life. Some philosophies of life are clearly non-religious, like existentialism, for instance, that Skye will be talking about a little later. Others are kind of in between, both Buddhism and Stoicism, for instance, although the Stoics were not really religious in any modern sense of the term, but they did believe in a God that they identified with the universe and nature herself. So here's a comparison table for three of these, right? We got Christianity, Buddhism, and Stoicism. I already talked about Christianity, but in terms of metaphysics, you know, if you're Buddhist, of course, you believe in something along the lines of the cycle of birth and rebirth, karma, and so on and so forth. If you're a Stoic, you believe in universal cause and effect. You're a physicalist for all effective purposes. Moving to the ethics, if you're a Buddhist, you accept the Four Noble Truths, you try to follow the Eightfold Path, and so on and so forth. If you're a Stoic, you practice the Four Cardinal Virtues or the three disciplines of Epictetus, about which I'll be talking more in a minute. And in terms of practices, if you're a Buddhist, you meditate in order to deflate the ego, which is supposed to be these, you know, the rapacious human ego is supposed to be at the origin, essentially, of suffering in the world, or much suffering in the world. So you want to counter that through meditation. You want to engage in loving kindness meditation and so on. If you're a Stoic, you keep a philosophical diary for self-analysis. You engage in a number of meditations. I will be giving a few examples in a minute, as well as exercises in self-restraint and appreciation, which I will also talk about more in a minute. So we don't draw these any kind of sharp demarcation, basically, between religions and philosophies of life. And in fact, if we count religions as a type of philosophy of life, then that means that pretty much everybody on the planet has a philosophy of life, right? Those are numbers that give you a rough estimate of the number of people that consider themselves Christians and, you know, that belong to Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism and so on and so forth. And, you know, if you put them all together, you get to, you know, whatever it is, 7 billion people. Even atheists or even, you know, people who are not believers, they usually do follow some kind of philosophy of life, either because they get it from their family or from the cultural environment, sort of in a kind of implied fashion, or because they actually positively embrace one, like ethical culture or secular humanism and things like that. So in our mind, then the real question is not whether one has a philosophy of life, because pretty much everyone does, but rather whether that philosophy of life actually stands up to scrutiny, especially as philosophers, but I would hope in general as, you know, rational people, and I mean the entire humanity in this group, then we might want to figure out, you know, well, I'm using something, let me see if it actually works well, if it actually makes sense. And what are the criteria that one could use? Well, it has to be useful. A philosophy of life has to be useful, because this is, we're talking about what the ancient Greek and Romans referred to as the art of living. And, you know, if it is an art and if it does not allow you to live well, then it's not particularly useful. And at the same time, you want it to be as coherent as possible. The Stoics in particular argued that a philosophy of life has to be coherent, internally coherent, but I would think that most people don't want to go around essentially espousing incoherent or contradictory thoughts, because then there will be a time when they might need to choose between one and the other versions, and at that point you have to resolve the incoherence. One important disclaimer that we want to make is that although we're going to be talking about Stoicism and existentialism in particular as examples, we actually don't believe that there is only one answer to the question of how you should live your life. On the contrary, there are many answers. However, there is not an infinite number of answers. And so the diagram that you're looking at here, it's borrowed from a completely different discipline. This has to do with population genetics, which happens to be my other field of interest. But basically what you can imagine is the vertical axis as a measure of the fitness or the usefulness of a philosophy of life. And you can see that there are some peaks that are in the positive range and other peaks that are in the negative range, right? So a negative philosophy of life would be something that is actually destructive, something that's actually not good for human beings. I don't know, let me pick on the obvious example. Nazism. If you're a Nazi, you probably have what I would consider a negative philosophy of life. It doesn't lead to flourishing and doesn't lead to well-being in general. But as you can see, there are different peaks, and of course, different peaks may have different heights depending on the individual, depending on the culture in which they're embedded. Right. So if we think of how to live a good life as a problem to be solved philosophically, then that problem definitely admits of multiple, although, as I said, not arbitrarily many solutions. Now, as we all know, Socrates very famously said that the unexamined life is not worth living. I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration. There's plenty of people who live a very worthy life without actually ever examining what they're doing. My grandfather, for instance. Nevertheless, because we're talking about philosophical reflection, I would argue that at least occasionally in one's life, it is a good idea to, in fact, examine what you're doing. Because even if you are doing things in the right way, even if things are working for you, there may be things that you can improve. That may be, even my grandfather could have, I think, benefited from philosophical insight. Of course, I can't talk to him right now because he died a few years ago. Now, there are three reasons we think for, at least occasionally, as we said, examine the variety of life philosophies. So not just your own, but actually sort of make yourself acquainted with other possible options in that landscape that I described a minute ago. One reason is to appreciate other people's points of view, right? So this intrinsically nurtured understanding of how people can take different paths. I am not a Buddhist, but I like to read about Buddhist philosophy because that makes me understand better what about 500 million people on the planet think. I'm not a Christian anymore, but I was raised Christian and I continue to engage with the Christian literature because that helps me figure out how 2.3 billion people live in the world live. So it's useful in terms of appreciating other people's point of view. The second reason is understanding more about, of course, your own philosophy of life, even one that you adopted by default. This actually came to me, became clear to me very, very obviously a few years ago when I did go through my, midlife crisis kind of thing. Up until that point, I considered myself a secular humanist for decades. And then when the rubber hit the road, so to speak, I realized that secular humanism wasn't helpful. It was just a nice set of ideas that, generally speaking, I agree with. But now that I actually was facing, issues and problems and I needed a way forward, that wasn't particularly useful. So that for me was the time to sort of start to understand better and eventually, in fact, reject what I consider my own philosophy of life. And then third, to question whether one's current philosophical outlook is actually looking, as I just said in the case of my own example, it turns out that when I did question it, I figured that, oh, this is not actually useful, very, very useful, and so let me look elsewhere, and that's how I moved forward. So let's start with after that preliminary remarks, those preliminary remarks, let's start with the first case study, which is Stoicism, and then Skye will talk to you about existentialism and then wrap things up before the Q&A. So Stoicism is, as you probably know, an ancient Greek-Roman philosophy. It originated in around 300 BCE, was established by a guy named Zeno of Citium, who was a Phoenician merchant who had lost everything in a shipwreck. He got to Athens, surviving the shipwreck. And of course, as anybody would, what would you do if you just lost everything? And in a shipwreck, you go into a bookstore. And that's what Zeno did. And he was, he picked up there the second volume of Xenophon's Memorabilia, which is, about Socrates. And he was struck by this. He turned to the bookseller and said, where can I find me one of these people, meaning a philosopher? And of course, this being Athens during the Hellenistic period, the bookseller just looked outside and said, oh yeah, there goes one. Just follow that guy. And that guy was Critias of Thebes, who was a Cynic philosopher. That's how Zeno got started. More than 10 years later, after he had studied with a number of other philosophers, he decided to start teaching on his own and eventually established his school, which is called Stoicism, because it is, they started out in something called the Stoa Poikile, or painting porch in central Athens. The picture you're looking at there, I took last year, and that is in fact the remains of the Stoa Poikile in the middle of Athens. I took the picture from a nice bar where I was, eating some olives and sipping nice drinks. And as soon as the pandemic is over, I can't wait to get back there. So Stoicism became a dominant philosophy in the Greek and Roman world, or at least co-dominant together with Epicureanism largely. And although there were a large number of other schools, of course, the Aristotelians were around, the academic Platonists were around, the skeptics were around, the Cyrenaics, and so on and so forth. Now, the basic Stoic approach, what I call the algorithm for a eudaimonic life, and I'm going to use the word eudaimonia here on purpose, the original Greek word. Even modern positive psychologists have given up on coming up with a translation. They just use eudaimonia. As you probably know, the frequent translation is happiness, but that doesn't really do it because happiness is a little vague concept. It means too many things to different people, and it's certainly, we're not talking about a feeling of elation in the moment or anything like that. It is often translated as flourishing, but in my opinion, that actually biases things in favor of the Aristotelian particular approach to eudaimonia. I prefer to translate it as the life worth living, because that's general as you can get. And then in fact, one way to think about it is that the different Hellenistic schools actually different among each other in the way in which they cashed out the word eudaimonia, what they meant by the life worth living. In the case of the Stoics, one of the basic precepts is that, or basic concepts is that we need to study three areas or topoi in order to figure out how to live our lives. One is the physics, what they call the physics, from the Greek physis, however, which just meant natural world, not physics in the narrow sense as we mean it today. And why is that? Well, because we need to figure out how the world works, or at least have some idea about how the world works if you want to navigate that world. We need to study logic, again, a term that is in scare quotes there because it had a much broader meaning at the time than we did today. It's not just formal logic. It also included what we today actually call psychology. It included rhetoric. It included a study of cognitive biases, basically anything that improves human reasoning. Why would that be? Well, because if you don't reason well about things, you're not likely to live a good life. And then finally, both of those feed into the ethics, another word that the ancients used in a much broader term than today. It wasn't just a study of right and wrong actions, but it was literally the study of how to live your life. So that algorithm that I just showed you is based on a Stoic axiom. which is often rendered as that we should live in accordance with nature. Now, let's be clear on what that means. This goes actually back to the very beginning of Stoicism. Zeno was the first one to use the phrase "in accordance with nature," and then it's been used ever since, including Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius and so on and so forth. But let's be clear on what that means. It doesn't mean that we should be stripped naked and going into the woods and hug trees, although there's nothing wrong with that. It also doesn't mean, more importantly, that anything that is natural is therefore good, because that would be, of course, a logical fallacy, an appeal to nature. What that means is that we should be focusing on what the Stoics at least thought were the two fundamental aspects of human nature that differentiate us from pretty much every other living organism on Earth, and those are the fact that we are highly social and the fact that we're capable of reasoning, sophisticated reasoning, right? The fact that we're capable of reasoning, of course, doesn't mean that we reason well all the time, in fact, or even most of the time, but nevertheless, we're capable of doing it. So living according to nature essentially becomes, we should live a life in which we use reason, which is our most powerful tool as animals, in order to improve society, in order to improve social living. That tells you right there that one of the stereotypes about Stoicism is incorrect. This is not an inward-looking philosophy. It is, by definition, outward-looking from the very get-go. So from both the physics and the logic, the Stoics derived what is sometimes referred to as the Stoic fork, or the dichotomy of control. In other words, the notion that of everything you can think of can be divided into two components: the component that is up to us and the component that is not ultimately up to us. Epictetus tells us that the only things that are really truly up to us are our considered judgments, endorsed opinions, and decisions to act or not to act. Not even our entire mental life is up to us, as you know, because random thoughts hit us all the time. But when it comes to things that we actually deliberately decide and think about, those are the things that are up to us, meaning that nobody can force you to change your judgment or your opinions, even at gunpoint. At gunpoint, it might be expedient for you to pretend that you change your opinions and judgments, but nobody can actually force you to do that. Those are really your things. On the other hand, pretty much everything else is not ultimately up to you. You can see there the list includes health, wealth, reputation, fame. Let's talk about health, since we're in the middle of a pandemic. What does that mean, that health is not ultimately up to me? Well, it means that I can do anything that is in my power to maintain or improve my health. I can go to the gym, I can eat a healthy diet, I can go to a doctor and practice preventive medicine, and so on and so forth. But then a virus struck me, and that's it. Or a car strikes me when I cross the street, and that's it. So ultimately, the outcome, in other words, is not under our control. What is under our control is the effort, is the decisions to make certain efforts, but not the outcome. Cicero perhaps puts it best in the third book of the Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, where he uses the analogy with an archer, and he says, imagine that there is this archer that is about to try to hit a target, let's say an enemy soldier. What is up to him and what is not up to him? Well, what is up to him is to choose the arrows and the bow, to take good care of them, to practice archery before the battle, to focus as much as he can before letting the arrow go. All that sort of stuff is up to him. But once the arrow leaves the bow, nothing is up to him. The enemy soldier may turn at the last moment and see that what's coming and duck, a gust of wind that can ruin the best shot possible, and so on and so forth. And so the Stoics basically turned this into the notion that we should essentially, as we would say today in modern parlance, internalize our goals. That is, we should be focused on what is up to us, meaning our efforts, our decisions to do or not to do certain things, and then cultivate an attitude of equanimity toward the outcomes. We're all adults. We know that sometimes life goes our way and other times it doesn't go our way. And when it doesn't go our way, we're not children. We don't throw a tantrum. We just say, well, all right, I'll try it again next time. There are two fundamental ways to practice Stoicism, or to orient yourself to a practice of Stoicism. One follows the four cardinal virtues, which actually go back to Socrates, and you find them in the Platonic dialogues. These are practical wisdom, which used to be referred to as prudence, from the Latin prudentia, or phronesis in Greek, courage, justice, and temperance. And the notion is to use these essentially as a moral compass. Every time you're approaching an issue or a situation, you should ask yourself, well, is this the prudent, courageous, justice, and temperate thing to do? And if it isn't, you don't do it. Let me give you a very modern example. Let's say that I go to work tomorrow, which I obviously won't because City College is shut down, but and then I find that my boss, who's actually a really nice guy, is harassing a coworker. The question is, should I intervene? And the answer, according to the Stoics, is, consult the 4 virtues. What does practical wisdom tell you? Well, practical wisdom for the Stoics reduces to, you should do anything, everything that improves your character, and you should try to stay away from anything that undermines your character. Not intervening in a situation like the one I described would be undermining my own character, so practical wisdom tells me that I should intervene. Does it take courage? Of course, because that's my boss. I could have, retaliation from him. So it does take a little bit of courage. Is it the just thing to do? Well, I'm treating my coworker the way in which I would like to be treated. I would like somebody to step up and take my defense if I were in that sort of situation. So yes, it is the just thing to do. And then, is it temperate? Well, that depends on how I do it. If I just mutter something under my breath so that my boss cannot actually even hear me, no, that's not enough. I underreacted. But if I jump up and start punching on the nose, that's overreacting. That's also not a good thing. So the temperate thing to do there would be, hey, to speak clearly and forcefully, but appropriately. The other way to practice Stoicism is following the 3 disciplines of Epictetus. These are desire and aversion, action and assent. Essentially, Epictetus says that we should always practice throughout our lives 3 things. We should reorient our desires and, of course, our aversions, which are simply negative desires. In other words, we should desire what is truly good for us. Train ourselves to desire what is truly good for us and not what other people tell us that is good for us. The discipline of action deals with how to actually act with other people, how to interact with other people in the world. And the discipline of assent is about improving our judgment. In fact, the discipline of assent is arguably the most important one because everything else depends on the discipline of assent. I have to have good judgment, or as good a judgment as I can, if I want to actually act in the world. Now, there are several other components of the Stoic system, which of course I have no time to go into right now, but one more I do want to bring up, and that because it's very important, and that is the notion of cosmopolitanism. You can see a quote by Epictetus there in the Discourses: do as Socrates did, never replying to the question of whether it was I'm an Athenian or I'm from Corinth, but always I'm a citizen of the world. And this is a notion that is central to Stoic practice. It doesn't mean that we are also not from Athens or Corinth or anything else. It just means that we're more importantly, more fundamentally human beings, and we should be treating every other human being accordingly as a rational being that is deserving of compassion, help, and so on, and respect. The picture to the left that you're looking at is from Hierocles, a 2nd century Stoic, who said that essentially naturally we are concerned with ourself. The smaller circle right at the bottom there of that sequence, with our own mind and body. This comes natural to us. Young children are concerned mostly about themselves and their mind and bodily integrity. But then we expand our circles of concern to include first our family, and then fellow citizens, and then countrymen, and then ideally, what you want to do is to expand it to the totality of the human race. And in fact, modern Stoics are adding an additional circle out there to include, in fact, the ecosystem as at large, because we are the steward of the ecosystem on planet Earth. Give Stoicism is a practical philosophy. We're talking about practical philosophies here, not just about sort of the theory. And so let me show you give you a few hints of how do you actually practice Stoicism. These are some of my own favorite exercises. But I co-wrote a book with Gregory Lopez last year called The Handbook for New Stoics, which actually includes a whopping 52 exercises. Each one of these is actually called from a quote from the ancient Stoics, and then it's brought up to the standards of modern science. We checked whether cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, which was inspired originally by Stoicism, provides empirical evidence to suggest that these things actually work. And so we selected only the exercises that actually are evidence-based, as we say today. So one such thing is the philosophical diary. This is the idea of before you retire for bed in the evening, ideally every day, but at least several times a week, you sort of pause and reflect on what happened during the day and ask yourself, how did I do things? What did I do wrong? And in which case you make a note. The idea is not to flagellate self-flagellate or anything like that. It's just to learn from your mistakes. You also want to pay attention to what you did right, because that's where you want to go. You want to do more and more things right. And then you also ask yourself, well, what could I do differently if a similar situation arises in the future? A second exercise here is that of minor physical hardships. The quote you see there is from Musonius Rufus, but there are similar ones in Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. And here the notion is, if there is something that you think is problematic, like for instance, in my case, I'm a little too much into, gourmet food or good food or, food, period. Well, then that's something that I need to work on. And so once a week, I actually fast. And the point of that is twofold. On the one hand, to remind myself that I don't need that thing, that I can do without it, at least for a certain period of time, so that I control my pleasures and I am not controlled by my pleasures. And the second reason for doing these kind of exercises is essentially an exercise in appreciation. After you fast for 24 or 48 hours, I guarantee you, whatever is on the table, even stale bread in a soup, tastes wonderful. And so you have an appreciation for the fact that normally you can actually pick your food as you like. There's other exercises that people do, depending, as I said, on what it is that they think that they need to work on. This is one of my favorite things. I do it on a regular basis with my wife. It's called the sunrise meditation. This actually precedes the Stoics. Marcus Aurelius tells us that goes back to the Pythagoreans of the 6th century BCE. And it's a way to sort of remind ourselves that we are part of a broader nature. It's a way to reconnect with the cosmos, right? You just get up early in the morning before dawn, make your coffee, find a spot where you can see the sunrise, and then you just stay there for half an hour. Don't look at the sun, of course, directly. Don't pull a Trump, basically. But why would you want to do that? Well, because even atheists or even agnostic or whatever it is, everybody needs a sense of transcendence, of a sense of being a part of something bigger. And we are part of something bigger. If the sun were not there every day, of course, there would be no life on Earth. And so to reflect for a few minutes in the morning before you start the rest of the day and you get all caught up into your local problems, this is a good way to sort of broaden your horizons, your perspective. This one is difficult for me, as Luke can testify. It's speak little, it doesn't come natural to me. And so I try to practice it in social occasions. One of the things, and try to sort of talk about interesting things and not about gladiators or horse races, as the quote from Epictetus says. It's easy actually these days, to be fair, not to talk about gladiators, but you can talk about football instead, and it's the same thing. The notion was put forth in an interesting way by Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, who said that the reason you have 2 ears and 1 mouth is because you should speak only half the time compared to when you listen to other people, and that's just good advice, good solid advice. Another exercise that I do on a regular basis is trying to speak about facts about others as opposed to judgments, right? So if somebody cuts me off on the highway, instead of saying, oh, look at that jerk, I can say, oh, look, that person was in a hurry. Because saying that somebody's in a hurry when he cuts you off the highway is just a description of facts. It doesn't involve any negative judgment. After all, you don't know whether he's a jerk or not. It may be, but it may also be that, his wife is pregnant in the hospital and he has to rush there to be at the birth of his son. Who knows? We have no idea. And so Stoics tend to suspend judgment about other people, try to take a little bit more sort of objective description of things and of people and events, so that we are not immediately jumping into unwarranted judgments. Now, the ultimate goal of all of this, of course, is something called Irete in ancient Greek, which simply translates as excellence. And in this particular case, of course, moral excellence, you want to become the best human being that you can. That statue is a statue of Irete, which I photographed at Heracles in Western Turkey, which is the birthplace of Epictetus. There's a wonderful standing Roman theater there, and that's one of the statues that you can find here. All right, now, Skye on existentialism.
Thanks, Massimo. I think I'm going to take over sharing screen. Okay.
I think I probably need to unshare my screen then.
Okay.
Yes, you do.
Right.
And then let Skye take over. Thank you, Massimo.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you seeing my screen?
In a moment, it says
Okay.
it's starting.
Yep.
Okay.
We see it starting. There
Yes.
we go.
Okay, great. So hi everyone. I'm going to talk about how existential philosophy can be helpful to living a good life, and using sort of how I came to existentialism as a bit of a case study. So I didn't used to have a philosophy of life that I was cognizant of. And so I got to my mid-20s and I was very much swimming in ambiguity. And around that time, there was a collision of a few factors in my life. So I was 27 years old doing an MBA, partly because I didn't know what else I wanted to do. And a lot of my friends were getting married, and I found there was a lot of family pressure to get married and deliver children myself. And also in pop culture, all around me were these narratives of finding the one, falling in love, getting married, having babies, and living happily ever after. And I started to question, is this the formula for a good or a happy life? Because it was certainly the one that I'd internalized. But I was also looking around and seeing that somewhere close to half of marriages were ending in divorce. My parents had a terrible marriage, and it just didn't seem like a good formula at all. I also had a boyfriend at the time who got very upset whenever I wanted to study instead of hang out with him, who was very upset when I suggested that I wanted to do a PhD because he thought that would be less time for him. And so I was very confused about all this. I was wondering, was I being selfish in wanting a relationship and to pursue my goals and dreams, or was he being selfish? And I was questioning whether there was such a thing as the one, and whether a good life is about finding the one. And if you find the one, how do you know? And asking questions about whether you can choose to love or whether you can choose not to love, because it seemed easier to fall out of love with someone than fall in love. I wasn't sure. And I read a book by Irving Singer. And in one of those books, he said something like, the love you get compensates for what you sacrifice. But I wasn't at all sure about that, because I knew often women were asked to sacrifice more. And even if you're in a relationship of equals, I wasn't sure, what that equation even looked like. Like, how much should you give up for the other person? And so during my MBA, I discovered Simone de Beauvoir. And also at that time, there was a book called Tête-à-Tête by Hazel Rowley, specifically on the relationship between Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Okay, so this is Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. What I learned and what I admired was the fact that they rejected social rules. So they didn't get married, they had an open relationship because it was an expression of their freedom. And that was very scandalous at the time. I mean, it was the 1940s, but I mean, still today, open relationships seem to be scandalous. I mean, I'm just looking at Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith on Twitter over the last day or two, and it's all still very scandalous. But Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre were very much committed to each other for their whole lives. So I wasn't so interested in the open relationship part, but what I really admired was the fact that they took a different path, that they explored other possibilities. And they emphasized that it's important for people to choose what's right for the people in the relationship. I mean, as long as it's adult and consenting. So yeah, I was fascinated by the fact that they created this relationship on their own terms that was different to the standard narrative that I'd been brought up with. So I was also taken in by the story of what existentialism was and how it came to be. So you probably already know this, but I'll just recap to refresh. So it basically all started with an apricot cocktail. So Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir were, they just finished at the Sorbonne and were drinking at a bar with their friend Raymond Aron. And they were complaining about philosophy and wondering why it was so abstract and boring. And Aron said, if you're a phenomenologist, you could make a philosophy out of this apricot cocktail. And Sartre said that this was an epiphany. And he remembers thinking, finally, there is philosophy. Because he wanted to philosophize about everyday life and everyday things. And I love that cocktails were like an everyday thing for them. So basically they didn't want to be armchair philosophers, you know, pondering hypotheticals and abstractions, but they were very interested in concrete living and the importance of establishing personal principles that are worth living for and dying for. And of course they were reacting to the Enlightenment, which was all about objectivity and scientific facts. And the existentialists, especially like Kierkegaard, started talking about the individual, subjective, passionate experience. And existentialism became very popular around World War II, probably because they acknowledged like the great human suffering that people were facing. And, you know, thinking about, you know, Nazi-occupied Paris, and if you're being tortured, you know, do you say something about where your friends are, knowing that they'll be killed? And how are you going to live with that choice? How are you going to sleep at night? So every day people were facing these really extreme, significant life and death choices. And the existential philosophers created a narrative to talk about this absurdity and this chaos of existence, where they stress the importance of individual freedom and responsibility. So it always was from the very beginning as kind of a living, practical philosophy. So some of the key themes of existentialism are just that existence precedes essence. So I didn't choose to be born, I didn't choose my parents, my nationality, my body. And there's no user guide or manual for life. So we're basically thrown into the world. The guides that we do have are deeply suspect and flawed. And so because we're kind of abandoned in the world, it's then up to each of us to choose and create ourselves. And I'm free to choose my actions, such as, you know, where I work, whether I marry, who I'm friends with. But with that freedom comes the burden of responsibility for my choices, which creates anxiety. So existentialism is often criticized for being like a very individualistic philosophy, but I think in particular Beauvoir's existentialism is counter to that, because it points out that if you respect freedom for yourself, then you should respect it for other people too, because we coexist and we share the earth. So of course, the goal of an existential life is to live as authentically as possible by pursuing goals that we choose for ourselves. And so I know authenticity is a really fraught concept, and it's something that I'm kind of looking into and researching a lot more at the moment. You know, it's so overused, and often people talk about it as if it's, you know, discovering your true self. And you want to do that because when we find it, we're going to be happy. But in existential thinking, there's no like predetermined essence. There's no true self just kind of waiting to blossom from the depths of our psyche. Existence precedes essence means that we have to create our essence. And authenticity is specifically being able to create ourselves in ways that we choose. So authenticity is not a static goal. It's not like you can say, oh yay, I found my authentic self finally. But it's something you strive towards through your actions. And it's a receding goal. It's not something you can ever actually achieve and be done with. And it involves testing out what's right and what's not. And of course, we're going to make mistakes. And it's challenging because we do have so many pressures from society and culture and friends and family that pull us in all these different directions. And Jean-Paul Sartre describes other people as being like drain holes, like sucking our being away from us. Now, I know that's very pessimistic, but the point is that, you know, other people tend to pull us and push us in these different directions that we're not always aware of. And certainly, I kind of agree with him in some ways, because there is a risk of becoming too dependent on other people's approval and becoming beholden to their views of us. And it's true that we often want to please other people because we want to feel accepted, and sometimes we betray ourselves for other people's benefit. But on the other hand, we need other people because that's how we learn about ourselves, and other people reveal aspects of ourselves that we wouldn't know without them. So they challenge us in good ways too, and sometimes they have really good ideas. So being defined by people too much is dangerous. And the other important thing about authenticity is that, of course, it's not always easy to figure out what is genuine and right. But Simone de Beauvoir points out that generally the authentic choice is the one that affirms freedom for ourselves and other people, that opens up choices and possibilities so that we can all kind of emerge into an open future. So, okay. So how spoiler alert, how existentialism can help us to live a good life. So this is a really challenging question, because you can't really reduce it to a set of doctrines or a set of like how-tos. You know, I'm not officially an existentialist. I mean, certainly not in the way that Massimo might call himself a Stoic. And the reason for that is there are no specific practices. In Christianity, for example, you have the 10 Commandments. In Stoicism, you have meditations and things like cold showers and fasting, as Massimo said, to remind us to be grateful for food and hot water. But in existential philosophy, there are overlapping themes, such as that we've got to work out the path and the meaning for ourselves. And unquestioningly kind of signing up for a set of rules or a doctrine that someone else created is inauthentic. And so it is, okay, so what they do have, although there are no specific guidelines, they do have guideposts or signposts. Jean-Paul Sartre said specifically, you know, don't follow me. I don't always live according to my philosophy, but I have done a lot of thinking about this, and that's the direction you might want to think about going. But of course, it's going to be our choice whether we want to follow him or not. And as Kierkegaard jokes, do it or don't do it, you'll regret both. He was a bit of a comedian. So the central idea is to be an agent in your own life. And actually, I read a book recently called Whistleblower by Susan Fowler. And she was the person who blew the whistle on Uber's toxic culture and racism and sexism. And, you know, she talks a lot about Stoicism and how Stoicism helped her kind of get through this dreadful situation. I think she was there for about a year at Uber. And so she talks about Stoicism, but there are actually a lot of existential themes in there about overcoming challenges, about how she kind of transcended poverty to get a good education. And she transcended like a really horrific workplace to reclaim her life. And she says quite a few times that it was a struggle to become the subject or the agent of her own life. Because at Uber, there were these toxic people kind of trying to drain herself away from her. I mean, she doesn't use those terms, but you know, she had no power there, and she kind of got her power back by speaking out and writing the books and kind of exposing all the terrible things that were happening, and becoming engaged in a broader sense, like not just standing up for herself, but standing up for other people. So there are lots of different ways existential philosophy can help us live a good life, but I'm certainly pursuing authentic projects is one way. But I also, for me, I think the way that we engage with other people is really important. And there are three particular ways I want to highlight now. So, oh no, I did that thing again. Okay, so the first is that society tends to channel us into certain paths that we're not always cognizant of, but should be. And, you know, I was kind of doing, I Googled life cycle on Google, and, you know, I came up with these different, if you look at these two pictures up the top, it's like, you know, fairly standard paths that everyone falls into. I got a little upset when I saw that, you know, the woman was the one who had the baby and not the man, but the man's like championing something or other. Anyway, so yeah, the point is that there are these standard paths that society tends to channel us into, and marriage is one of them. And, you know, so it's sort of, there are these standard paths that we get railroaded into, and marriage is one of them. For example, there are tax incentives and health insurance benefits that we get from doing this. And, you know, the Hollywood and the Disney happy ending kind of upholds this romantic ideal that love is about finding our soulmate. And we have, you know, this is the picture of Aristophanes' myth in Plato's Symposium, where, you know, we're all sliced in two, and ever since then we've been looking for our other half to become complete. So these kind of narratives, sure, they're changing now. And I don't know if anyone saw Marriage Story on Netflix sort of earlier this year. So yeah, there are stories like this coming out that show kind of alternative narratives, but the current still runs really deep. And so the second path is that, or the second idea is that there is no formula which guarantees happiness and understanding. And so I think that I found this really powerful for the decisions that I sort of made, that, you know, and that Beauvoir and Sartre kind of helped me to realize, you know, these other paths that I wasn't initially aware of. And, you know, I was originally going to do the handshake, but then I was like, yep, in times like this, we're supposed to do elbow bumps. But in fact, I think it's not about touching anymore. So anyway, so yeah, the point is that in existential philosophy, we're condemned to be free. And so we have to choose to work it out together. And we can choose otherwise. We can choose against the social kind of railroad, although there are certainly costs associated with that, and it can be dangerous. You know, consider the stigma around polyamory or open relationships or discrimination against trans people. So there are costs to doing it. So the point is that authenticity can be dangerous, I guess. Okay, so the second key point I want to emphasize is Beauvoir's understanding of love. And so she said that authentic love is a mutual recognition of two freedoms. And she thought this was the best kind of love, and it's about figuring out goals together. And authentic love inspires us to be better people, and not just selfishly within the couple, but to be better people in the world. And that's what I wanted. I wanted someone who supported my ambitions and respected my freedom in the same way that I respected theirs. So not the boyfriend that was mad because I was doing a PhD, but, you know, I ended up meeting a guy who thought me doing a PhD was really cool. So of course I wanted to marry him immediately. I didn't. Well, I didn't marry him. I did marry him, but not immediately. And the third key point is that authentic relationships are founded on great friendship. So we're used to hearing this from the ancient philosophers, of course, but it's also really important in, for example, Nietzsche's writing and Beauvoir's writing. And great friendship is respecting the other person in their freedom. And now that doesn't mean being tolerant. For example, Nietzsche says, "Let your pity for your friend conceal itself under a hard shell. You should break a tooth biting upon it. Thus it will have delicacy and sweetness." So the best kind of friendships include constructive criticism, disagreements, and challenges. And one way to look at them is like gardens. So we need to tend to them, nurture them, and repair them when storms mess it up. And I just watched Mr. and Mrs. Smith recently, and I thought that was a really good example of an authentic relationship. It didn't start out authentically. Initially, it was the traditional marriage where, you know, they fell in love, they got married, there were home-cooked meals on the table every night, and they're in a therapist's office, and they said, one of them said, you know, there's a void of what we don't say to each other. What's that called? And the therapist says, marriage. And so they had so many facades early on, you know, doing what they thought they were supposed to be and supposed to do, and doing what they thought the other person wanted. And then, of course, they find out that they're both assassins hired to kill each other. And initially they're fighting, but then they kind of unite and, you know, they fight together and recognize each other's strengths and, you know, treat each other as equals. And it becomes a much more honest kind of team. And, you know, one of the funny lines is one of them says, well, we're going to have to redo every conversation we ever had now because it was all based on a lie before. So they didn't have all, so Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, the existential philosophers, I mean, they didn't have all the answers. I think there's no hard and fast formula for a happy life or happy relationships, but it is that we've got to work it out for ourselves. But what I like about existential philosophy is that it gives us a way to talk about love and to explore the dynamics and the expectations, and acknowledges that we're thrown into the world where others are there. So existentialism shows that ambiguity is okay and it's a fact of life, and that it's important to hold ourselves in question. But of course, there are plenty of philosophies and religions that do provide more concrete guidance than existentialism. But even so, there's room for interpretation. So Duderija, who wrote the chapter on progressive Islam in our book, he kind of talks about the way he practices Islam that promotes moral equality for everyone, regardless of beliefs or backgrounds or gender, and how he supports women's reproductive rights and leadership, which is very different to traditional Islam. And Rabbi Barbara Bloch, who wrote the chapter on Judaism, says that there's a saying, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, because they encourage multiple opinions precisely because there are different ways of getting to the same goal. But all these philosophies and religions are grappling with what Massimo talked about in the beginning, so an ethics and a metaphysics, and they're looking for the meaning of life and trying to answer the question of how to live. So in conclusion, I'll just mention that, you know, I think there is a spiritual crisis going on in humanity at the moment. The quest for meaning used to be quite a luxury for just the very few people who had the time to actually think about it. I mean, traditional religion has often been challenged, but perhaps even more so than ever. You know, science hasn't been able to fill this void of how to find meaning and how to get along with other people. We have existential threats, the pandemic, the threat of nuclear war, increasing isolation and social distancing. There's like a lot of chaos going on. We're overloaded with, you know, conspiracy theories and fake news. You know, a lot of this at the moment, you know, antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication is skyrocketing. And as we all know from Lou's book, Plato, not Prozac. But no, of course, there's certainly a role for medication. But for the moral questions in life, Massimo and I came together to talk about this as this book was being pulled together, and we thought, you know, we need something to open up possibilities for people. And as Dan Kaufman writes in our conclusion, there are universal principles, and that is the need for meaning and a sense of agency, compassion for others, and the idea that cooperation and pro-sociality are the best ways to ensure human flourishing, you know, regardless of one's metaphysical views. So there's not a quick fix. I don't think there's like an algorithm that's going to guarantee a good life, because philosophy isn't a life hack. But we do think that philosophy can be an opening or a gateway to understand different perspectives and challenge people to reflect not only on their own philosophy of life, because we think it can be helpful. And certainly I went from being kind of a capitalist worker bee in an MBA to an existential philosopher. And Massimo says he says it in the book, so I'm not giving away any secrets here, I don't think. But he was going through a midlife crisis, and instead of buying a Ferrari, he did a third PhD and discovered Stoicism. So I think it's important to enter into a conversation with other perspectives and to better understand people who have chosen differently. And I think the world sure as hell needs that right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Skye. And that was a wonderful, really, really nice juxtaposition of existentialism with Stoicism, an ancient philosophy and a modern one, which seem to fit comfortably together. And now we have some time. If anyone would like to pose questions, either Skye or Massimo, please either raise your hands or type one in, and we'll be glad to challenge them a little bit. Does anyone have something to?
Yeah, somebody has a hand up.
Okay. Someone has a hand up. Thing is, we have so many participants, Massimo. I can't see the whole list. So there we go.
No, if you look at the bottom of the screen, yeah.
VJ,
the blue
VJ.
hand.
Yeah, I see VJ's hand up.
Yes,
please go ahead, VJ. You're still with us. Go ahead. From India.
No, I'm actually in San Francisco, though I'm from India, but I'm based in San Francisco.
So you're still with us.
Yes, I am. So I have a question for Massimo and a question for Skye as well. But for the question for Massimo, in your presentation, you mentioned that the Stoic aim in life is Irete at the end. But I've heard you say, maybe in some talks or podcasts that I'm avidly watching and listening, that ataraxia is actually the aim of Stoicism at some time. So I was wondering, is it in the final analysis ataraxia as in the steady mind and equanimity? And for that, there are actually parallels in Indian philosophy as well. I wanted to actually mention in the morning during Bala's talk, but I think there are clear parallels to ataraxia and Indian Hindu philosophy.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So actually, the relationship between arete, which is typically translated as virtue, although it's got not much to do. I shouldn't say nothing, but not much to do with the Christian version of virtue. But the difference between arete and ataraxia is actually one of the things that distinguish the Stoic school from the Epicurean school. For the Epicureans, the goal is ataraxia, it's tranquility. It's like, going through life with a serenity, and virtue is a instrument to get you there. For the Stoics, it's essentially the other way around. The goal is virtue. The goal is become the best human being you can. And as a nice side product, you also get ataraxia as a result. So you get this tranquility, but it's a byproduct in the case of the Stoics. That's why this morning, for instance, we heard this famous phrase that the Stoic sage is happy even on the rack, right? Which is, of course, what Cicero calls rightly a Stoic paradox, because like, what do you mean happy on the rack? Well, by happy, they meant that if the sage is on the rack, he's being tortured because he's trying to do the right thing, because he's trying to actually help the world and so on and so forth, then his life is still worth living. His life is still a eudaimonic life. He's still exercising virtue. Obviously, he's not into ataraxia. He's not tranquil because he's being tortured. And the sage is not a Superman. He feels the pain. But it's the pain, it's worth it because you're doing it for good reason, for a virtuous reason. So that's the distinction between the two schools of Stoicism and Epicureanism. Really hinges on this relationship between arete and ataraxia.
Okay, Maria is next up.
I had a question for Skye as well, very quickly.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Vijay.
Okay, so Skye, on the concept of existential authenticity, I was wondering, if authenticity means being true to oneself, if it conflicts with, let's say, virtue in the traditional sense, as in, you mentioned also how, the importance of cooperation, compassion, and pro-sociality, and all those other, qualities that help you thrive and flourish. let's say if authenticity actually directly conflicts with any of these good qualities that help you thrive and help others thrive, what happens then? Let's say I'm talking in terms of like a racist or a bigot or maybe even a sociopath or a psychopath. What is authenticity for them? Should they pursue their authenticity just as others would?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would say no. And I think that's specifically one of the issues that Beauvoir was trying to respond to. Because, I think it was Forsuch who talked about authenticity, but, never wrote anything much about ethics. And that's why Beauvoir ended up writing The Ambiguity of Ethics. The Ethics of Ambiguity. Because she wanted to respond to that. What if it's authentic to be an awful person? But the issue is like finding your true self is not, I think the existential philosophers would phrase it differently, because it's not, your true self isn't something that you find, like it's not already there, it's something that you create. And so it's almost like forward looking. So Beauvoir was very, and that's the meaning of existence precedes essence, that, we need to create our essence. And she emphasized how we need to create it in a way that doesn't like trample all over other people. But she acknowledged that, we may never reach world peace because we do have different goals and we do kind of clash and our projects clash and we bump into each other. But the important thing is not to oppress other people and stamp on other people to try and get ahead ourselves. And it's to, one of the concepts she talks about is intersubjectivity. So I think like dominating other people and oppressing them is not treating them like an end in themselves. So she's a little bit Kantian in that respect. And so what we need to strive for is to treat everyone, to recognize everybody's subjectivity.
Okay, we have a lot of questions and comments, so I'll ask the questioners to be brief, please, and the respondents to be equally brief. It's always hard for us philosophers, but we'll try and get everyone, okay, to voice their questions or comments. Please go ahead, Maria, and then John, and then Patricia, okay?
Hello, thank you very much, Massimo and Skye. Yeah, that was brilliant, because I have an interest in existentialism myself. So this question is for both of you, because we refer to religions that they do count as philosophies of life. So I was wondering, and I'm always wondering, can you be a Christian, but according to what you have presented, have a different philosophy of life? Or can you be, well, this one, can you be a Christian and an existentialist? I think we well know that Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, they were more of theological existentialists. So this probably it's a yes. I don't know if you agree. But, my question is about, if you are a Christian, if you can have then a different approach in terms of philosophy of life. For example, to have the Stoic approach, or have an existentialist approach if you want to improve your life?
Yeah, I think that the answer is yes, although there's disagreement about this. There's a book that came out a few years ago called One True Life, for instance, where the author argues that Stoicism and Christianity are actually incompatible. I don't think so, and I'm not the only one not to think so. I'll give you a couple of reasons for it. First of all, during the Renaissance, for about a century or so, there was a fairly vibrant movement referred to as Neo-Stoicism, which was started by Justus Lipsius and included people like Montaigne, for instance, and where they were developing exactly that, a Stoic version of, a Christian version of Stoicism, essentially. And in fact, Descartes apparently was influenced by the Neo-Stoics as well. We don't see that through his official philosophy because he never writes about it, but we do see it through his letters, his personal letters to people. So that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is that a lot of Stoicism is actually being incorporated into Christianity from the very beginning. Paul of Tarsus actually addressed a number of Stoic philosophers. He was aware of Seneca. He was actually, he knew Seneca's brother, for instance, and he tried to incorporate certain aspects of Stoicism right from the beginning. I mentioned the 4 cardinal virtues. As you know, there are 7 Christian virtues. Those 7 Christian virtues were canonized by Thomas Aquinas. And if you look at the 7, actually the first 4 are the Stoic virtues, the practical wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance that Thomas Aquinas just took and incorporated straight into the Christian framework and added the 3 more Christian ones of hope, faith, and charity. So there's been a lot of, and also I should mention, Epictetus Enchiridion, his manual for life, is actually being used throughout the Middle Ages as a manual for spiritual exercises by Christian monks, with the only difference that whenever Socrates was mentioned, Jesus replaced Socrates. But other than that, it was about the same thing. So clearly there are a lot of points of contact, I think, between the 2 philosophies. So I don't think that it's inconceivable to think of a Christian Stoic. On the contrary, I mean, even from a metaphysical perspective, the Gospel of John, of course, famously starts with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. And the word there is logos, right? Which is exactly the word that the Stoics use to refer to this kind of rationality embedded into the universe. So you can think of the logos as the laws of nature and their rational construct, or you can think of them as the Christian God. I really don't think it makes a hell of a lot of a difference in the end. So my answer would be yes, but it is controversial. There are people who actually argue otherwise.
Yes, yeah, I agree with that. And, obviously, as you said, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, and we have all these, the fathers of the Eastern, let's say, theological tradition. We know that all of them, they did study philosophy, they did study the ancient Greeks or Roman philosophy and so on. But, I'm wondering how we can work on that practically when we're talking about practicing philosophy. And let's say an example, you have a client, so he's coming, he's a Christian. So how, what is the line that we can and we cannot cross here, not to offend someone's, religious instincts? Right. This is,
well,
I do something to use the Christianity route for them by using the fathers of the church and philosophy, or we are showing them a different philosophy of life?
Maria, excuse me, we have to move on. We're going to tackle that next weekend, and you're in the program, so we'll be handling these kinds of hypotheticals, okay? This takes us pretty far astray at the moment. John, John has a question. He's been waiting patiently, and so has Laura with a question, and to Skye, and we're running out of time, so please be brief, okay, if you can. John.
Thank you. Superb presentations, both, and I love the complementarity between them. And I would agree with sort of placing these philosophies of life alongside religious traditions of Christianity, etc. What I'd like you to spend a few moments thinking about is issues of orthodoxy and doubt, and that most religions promote or prize some level of orthodoxy and discourage to some extent doubt. Philosophy tends to have some skepticism toward orthodoxy and to encourage doubt. And I'm thinking in particular in the context of philosophical counseling, I would see a danger of introducing someone to, say, Stoicism as their orthodoxy, such that they sort of embrace it and never look back and are uncritical of it and don't continue to sort of cultivate doubt, as opposed to, say, embracing Stoicism, but genuinely being attentive to its foundations and its limitations and alternative assumptions, et cetera, and to continue to kind of have an underlying or an accompanying doubt, even as they embrace Stoicism or even as they embrace existentialism.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. For one thing, the distinction you're drawing is the reason why I'm a philosopher and not a theologian. Yes, I prefer the open inquiry and the constant questioning rather than sort of the dogma. Also, in terms of practice, I actually go along with what Lou was saying this morning. I don't present my clients with, hey, here's Stoicism. You want to take this on. What I do is I first explore, of course, what their background is, what their thinking is, and what their problems is. And when I draw from Stoicism I draw from the tools of Stoicism, from the practical exercises, from certain suggestions about how to think about stuff. And the classic example is the dichotomy of control, right? So when Epictetus says some things are up to us and other things are not up to us, and we should focus on the first and take the rest with equanimity. Well, that's exactly the same sentiment that is behind the famous Serenity Prayer, which is a Christian early 20th century prayer, right? So it's the same exact thing. And in fact, you can find the same sentiment in medieval Judaism, in 8th century Buddhism. It's really all over the place. So you can use, I think, to a point, several of the tools without necessarily having to get into the background metaphysics, background assumptions. Now, that said, if the client or says, hey, this sounds cool, where does that come from? Then I say, okay, well, here's the resources. If you want to explore the origin of that thing, if you want to explore that philosophy as a comprehensive approach to life as opposed to a series of techniques, then here's where you can go for that. But I do that not just for Stoicism, I do that for whatever it is that I sense might be useful to the client. If it's existentialism, then I'll go that way. If it is Taoism, then I'll go that way. I think it's not up to us, at least certainly not up to me as a counselor to try to impose any particular worldview on the client. It is up to me to try to, to use the Socratic phrase, do the midwifery, right? Get it out of the client more than imposing it. So
exactly. Thanks, Massimo. One final question from Laura to Skye, and then this is really a yes or no question, Skye. We'll give you a minute, okay? But we really have to wrap up. Remember, their email addresses are in the program and on the website if they've created their profiles. So please feel free to continue the dialogue. It's always a wonderful thing when we have more dialogue than time. That's a positive sign. Laura asks, Skye, do you agree with de Beauvoir that women need financial independence in order to keep their autonomy and possibility of existential authenticity? Can you give us a 30-second response?
I mean, a short answer is yes, but it's sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And I think Beauvoir would say it's like a first step, but just having the ability to walk away, I think is a very practical, walk away from an oppressive relationship and not having to depend on anyone is, an important part of it. But but it's complicated. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you both. Tremendously well done. Thanks a lot for your presentations. We now have an 11-minute break and not a 15-minute break, so make your coffee instant. And we will be back with a really interesting synthesis of Indian and Stoic philosophy with Ashwini Mokashi at exactly 2:30. Okay, see you shortly.